Bonjour and welcome back. In the last lecture, I left you in a moment of peril. The United States had hit a major roadblock. The stock market had crashed and dropped by 80%. Unemployment had skyrocketed to 25% of the population. And generally there was a sense that American free market democracy was in peril, and maybe the fascist model from the far right, as in Hitler's Germany, or the communist model from the far left, as in Stalin's Soviet Union, might be better for the United States. So the 1932 election was crucial in that regard because the next president might make or break the country. So it was assumed that in the 1932 election, the Democratic candidate would be elected for sure, Hoover being so unpopular on the Republican side. And if the Democrats had even nominated a goat, then I'm pretty sure we would have had the first goat to ever serve in the White House. So thankfully, the Democrats did not nominate a goat. In fact, they nominated one of the most gifted politicians in the history of US political history. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. About his background, you should be quite familiar with him because Franklin D. Roosevelt is related to Theodore Roosevelt. So the comments that apply to Theodore Roosevelt would also apply to Franklin Roosevelt, who was his cousin and also came from the same patrician background. Patrician meaning old money, elite. He too came from New York and in fact was so rich that as a young man he was quite unimpressive, the kind of person who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, who was quite gifted but never applied himself to anything because, well, daddy and mommy are rich, so who cares? So he went to Harvard, where his main ambition there was to become the editor of a student paper, and he did that and didn't do anything else. And then after that headed to Columbia Law School, just like Theodore Roosevelt, and I don't think he even finished law school. The minute he passed the bar, he figured, let's get out of here. So a rather unimpressive man. He did serve as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and that's during World War I. He was a Democrat, so he served in the Wilson administration. Just like Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin was fascinated with ships, and so he acquitted himself quite well with that job. Do notice that he served in the same function had Theodore Roosevelt had served during the Spanish-American War. So there's really a lot of parallels, at least early in their career. And just like Theodore, Franklin was dreaming of becoming governor of the state of New York, which was the most populous state in the nation back then, a big stepping stone for the presidency. But Franklin Roosevelt was a progressive, and he thought that he would clean up the state of New York from all the corrupt machine politics, specifically the Democratic Party machine in New York, what is called Tammany Hall. He was naive, young, idealistic, and then he lost in the primary. And he learned an important lesson there because that was the first time in his life, as a rich young man, that he had ever suffered defeat. The lesson that he learned was do not upset the wrong people, learn the virtue of pragmatism in politics. And you'll see that throughout his career in the New Deal. This is a person that does not deal in absolutes. He was willing to do one thing and the opposite as a way to be politically expedient. It is kind of infuriating when you study him, but also endearing and, in a way, what made him such a successful politician. Another big thing that happened to him when you get to the 1920s is that he suffered from polio, which is a disease that people are not too frightened with today because we now have a successful vaccine, at least as long as people are not stupid enough not to get their kids vaccinated. But the vaccine dates from the 1950s, so before that it was one of the more dreaded diseases in America. Killed a lot of children or left them crippled, and it was pretty common in America to see people walking with braces and such because they had been crippled by polio. And that's what happened to Roosevelt. So in his case, he did not contract the disease as a child, but more as an adult. He did survive in part because his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and we'll talk about her more later, kind of helped him and nursed him back to health. One thing about his polio that is remarkable is that for the rest of his life, he was in a wheelchair or could barely stand up, only with the help of braces. But as a matter of courtesy, he asked for the journalists to never portray him in a way that was weak, in his wheelchair and such. And amazingly, even though he served as president for 12 years and he was the most photographed man in America, you can't find pictures of Franklin Roosevelt as a handicapped person trying hard to use his braces and such. Nowadays, the press tends to be a bit less respectful of the private life of famous people. In the 1930s, it was a whole different thing. In more recent years, there was a decision to make a monument in Washington, D.C. on the Mall in honor of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And there was a big debate as to whether he should be represented as a handicapped person because he was the first a disabled man elected to the presidency, or to respect his wishes when he was a man alive and to present him in a way that would be more neutral. On the plus side for Roosevelt, since he was out of the picture for most of the 1920s, he escaped all these fratricidal fights, fights between brothers that you have in the Democratic Party throughout the 1920s between the wet and the dry portion of the Democratic Party. So by the time he got back into politics, he could be appearing as more of a centrist candidate that could accommodate all branches of the party, in part based on his successful record as governor of New York. So in 1932, he ran for the nomination in the Democratic Party, and he managed to obtain it, which meant most likely that he would be the next president of the United States. Though not too impressive. Walter Lippmann, who was a pundit, he wrote on politics in the papers and such, was quite unimpressed by him, and he said, and I quote, "This is a nice young man who would very much want to be president, but has absolutely no qualifications for the job," unquote, which turned out to be a liability when Roosevelt was elected president and showed that he had qualifications for the job. In fact, was elected 4 times to the presidency and served longer than any other president. Such are the perils of punditry. But to be fair, during the campaign, it was not quite clear what Roosevelt would do. He was very vague about what he would do if elected. There's one famous case when he was asked to deliver a speech on the tariff, and he talked to 2 of his speech makers, and he asked one of them to deliver a speech where he would to say that the tariff should be high, meaning a protectionist policy to protect domestic manufacturers, and the other speech maker was supposed to make a speech saying that the tariff should be low, which would be more in keeping with traditional democratic traditions. And when the 2 speech makers came to meet him, his answer was, well, kind of merge the 2. And the 2 speech makers were kind of at a loss because the tariff is an either-or solution. Either the tariff is high or it is low. But Roosevelt said, no, merge the 2. And that's a speech that he eventually delivered, one where he said that the tariff should be high and low at the same time. And that's very typical of the kind of mushy politics that Roosevelt was known for, trying to be all things to all people. So he was eventually elected president in 1932. Back then, inauguration was in March of the next year, so that's when he became president. Since the presidency of Roosevelt, the inauguration has been moved up to January. When he became president, so March of 1933, there was really a big crisis in the United States. When you look at all these statistics about the GDP and unemployment and all these things, they really hit rock bottom in the spring of 1933, and people were really quite desperate and having no idea whatsoever what Roosevelt would do because he had been so vague during the campaign. Well, he ended up being very active, so active in fact that it's kind of difficult to make sense of everything that he did. Dozens of laws are passed very quickly. And so to make sense of his program, historians have grouped them in what is called the first New Deal that happened the first year that he became president, and then a second New Deal a couple of years later. And some historians would even say that there's a third New Deal that happened a couple of years later. The New Deal being his campaign slogan that he would create a New Deal for America. What's remarkable overall about the New Deal is how much of a break it was with American tradition. So far, we've talked a lot about the conservative politics of the Gilded Age and so forth. And even the progressive generally wanted to restore competition. So everybody's committed to a rather small government and the marketplace being the solution. Well, Roosevelt is all about the government offering the solution because the marketplace to him had failed to offer a solution for the first few years of the Great Depression. Also, traditionally, it takes a long time for Congress to pass a law. You have to introduce a bill in committee, and then if it's successful, it might make it to the floor, and then it might be amended, and then it will go to a committee in the Senate, and then again to the floor, and you have amendments, and usually it's not the same text that gets passed in both chambers, and so you have a committee to reconcile both versions of the law, and then it goes to the president, who might veto the bill, and then it goes back all the way to Congress, and it takes forever for a bill to become a law. Well, not so in the first New Deal. There's such a sense of emergency that sometimes Roosevelt thinks of a bill in the morning, people draft the text, it goes to the House, and by noon it's passed the House, and in the afternoon it passes the Senate, and by the end of the day it's back on the president's desk and it's signed. And dozens of laws are passed very, very fast. In fact, people speak of the first New Deal sometimes as the first 100 days, because most of these laws are passed in just 100 days. And ever since then, it has become kind of a way to measure the success of presidents. You always stop after 3 months and ask new presidents, what have you done after 100 days? And usually it's kind of a failure because by comparison with Franklin D. Roosevelt, obviously they have not passed dozens of new laws. So what are the laws that are passed in that first New Deal? One of them is the establishment of the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or AAA. And it's kind of complicated to deal with all the acronyms that you have in the New Deal. People spoke of an alphabet soup because there were so many AAAs and NRAs and WPAs that people get confused. And in some cases, it corresponds to another institution with the same name today, which becomes even more confusing. So in that case, a AAA is not the one that will give you a free tow if you get stranded on the highway. It has to do with agriculture. What was the problem in agriculture? Well, a glut on the market. That aside from the area hit by the Dust Bowls, most farmers were too productive, so you have a surplus of milk and corn and rice and everything else. Countries overseas are not buying it because they are suffering through the Great Depression, and the tariff walls are high, so people are retaliating by not buying American, and your local people in the US, because they're hit by 25% employment, they're not buying either. So the price of milk is very low, and even at the low price, farmers can't sell enough, and they're just dumping milk outside on the street. So you have a paradox that is called the paradox of want in the midst of plenty. At the same time that farmers are dumping milk because it's too much, you have some hungry kids living in Hoovervilles who cannot buy food. So how do you kind of reconcile those two extremes? The solution by FDR was to create an agency that's the solution to everything, and that would give subsidies to farmers in order to produce less. So you get money from the government to put maybe a quarter of your land fallow and not farm it, so that you will reduce the amount that is produced. Same thing with cattle or pigs, if you have any. And in fact, there's a program by the government to kill every fourth piglet in America to reduce the amount of pork produced. That's the Great Piglet Massacre of 1933, one of those terrible events that we will study in the class. That AAA was successful in getting the amount produced to go down, which through the law of supply and demand means that the price is recovered, and that helped the farmers. Though that means that if you are a person living in a Hooverville and you could not afford milk before, well, now that the prices have recovered, you definitely can't afford the price of milk now. So people criticize Roosevelt for dealing with the problem of want in the midst of plenty by getting rid of the plenty, and you still have the want that is there. Ultimately, the AAA was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, so that agency no longer exists, but we still have the same kind of policy of giving subsidies to farmers, which actually is a huge program nowadays, and it's a big part of the income of farmers. So nowadays, those farm subsidies are typically incitement to production. You get money for producing stuff rather than producing less, which was a policy during the first New Deal. At any rate, if you're a farmer and you're wondering why the government is in the business of giving you subsidies, it goes back to the first New Deal. What about industry then? There is another big problem in industry, which is kind of similar, which is also a glut, that car manufacturers, they can't find customers for their cars. So their policy is to cut down the price of cars, and you have ruthless competition. And in order to match the price of cars, they have to cut down workers or cut down their pay to be able to make a profit, and even then they don't. So the solution by Roosevelt is, no big surprise there, to create another agency that he called the National Recovery Administration, or NRA, having nothing to do with the gun lobby today. The NRA in that case would be a way to set up cartels in industry. Cartel industry is where you have several companies getting together and agreeing on how much you're going to produce, the market share, and the prices. And normally that is illegal. Chrysler and Ford and GM cannot get together and agree on how much market share they'll have and what price they'll sell their pickups at. It is forbidden. It goes against the principles of competition. But it was briefly legal in the 1930s as a way to reduce the kind of cutthroat competition that was damaging profits in industry. So the NRA was a huge bureaucracy that set up cartels in just about every sector, whether it's car manufacturing or making buttons or butcher shops, I mean, everything. And for all of those, there are very strict rules on what can you sell at that price and what's the market share of each company. And in response for that, you have to pay your workers a certain amount. So it helped the economy recover somewhat, at least the prices for industry, though again, it would be bad for customers. Ultimately, it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court as well, so the NI is no longer with us, at least not the National Recovery Administration version of the NI. Another problem on the desk of the president would be the vast unemployment rate of 25% or so. So what do? Well, let's create an agency, or multiple agencies in that case. Things like the Civil Works Administration, or CWA, or the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, and that's the TVA. What do? Well, overall, it's a plan to hire unemployed workers, and you have a lot of them in America, and then put them to work, doing usually public works projects. So they might be going to national parks and building trails and inns and that kind of thing. And if you travel to national parks today, you have a lot of places that are a legacy from the time of the WPA. Or you might create buildings for academic institutions. In fact, the institution where I work in Louisiana, if you look at the oldest buildings on campus, there are little signs there that say built by the WPA or built by the CWA. And that's true also of a lot of airports. That's a time when the airline industry was really picking up, and a lot of airports were built by such work programs. The TVA would be in the same kind of vein. It was focused more on Tennessee, as the name indicates, an area of Appalachia that was quite poor, and the idea was to dam various tributaries to the Tennessee River, the goal being to do some flood control projects, but also have some lakes for amusement and so forth, and build tourism. And most importantly, put the turbines in those dams, and then you would have plenty for hydroelectric power. This way, all the people in the area would have electricity for the first time, and you would industrialize the regions. People making aluminum, for example, or concrete require a lot of energy, so they might relocate to that area. So it was a big success. The CWA or the WPA no longer exists today, but the TVA is still alive and well. It's one of the long-term legacies of the New Deal. Well, who else could you hire with those work programs? Well, maybe unemployed historians, because that's one of the great tragedies of the New Deal, along with the Piglet massacre. You have some unemployed historians. So the WPA might employ some of them to create oral histories, or maybe visitors' guides for different states and things like that. And some of these programs were quite useful. In particular, historians were taught to interview elderly Black people in the South, some of whom had grown up when it was before the Civil War, so had actually been slaves as kids. So by interviewing them in the 1930s, it was a way to have an oral history and to be able to understand what life was like for a slave from a slave perspective. You've all heard of the stereotype of the starving artist. Well, they're not doing too well during the Great Depression either. And they're also employed by the WPA, usually to beautify buildings like post offices, museums, and the like. They pay by the square foot, so they build big things to get paid more, and it's usually murals, and they're in very distinctive style, celebration of the workplace and workers and farmers and such. So when all of that happened, Roosevelt had no idea how the public would react. You don't have instant polling data back then. The Gallup organization first appeared in the 1930s, and whatever polls they have are not very reliable, and they're quite rare. So what he had done was very unprecedented, broke with decades of tradition in the United States. So the only way to know whether people would accept this or not would be to wait for the next election, and that's the midterm election of '34, and see how the public would react. And as it turned out, people just loved it. And so a large Democratic majority was elected to the House and the Senate, took office again in '35, and based on that, programs which were even more daring, and that's what constituted the second New Deal. So where the first New Deal was all about getting America out of its slump, the second one is more about liberal welfare entitlements. One problem that he encountered was poverty for old people. In the 1930s, people tend to live longer due to improvements in medicine. How do you survive in retirement, however? Well, you put some money aside, and unfortunately, with the stock market crashing in 1929, many people had lost their lifelong savings. So you have a lot of hurt among old people, and half the states had no retirement benefits whatsoever. The other half had very minimal retirement benefits. So that led to the creation of the Social Security Program in 1935, and it still exists today. In fact, it's the big legacy of the New Deal that we still have today. Here's how it works, because, well, it's still affecting your paychecks today. So you take money from people who are working, and that goes into a trust fund, And that money is then used to pay out retirement benefits to all people who initially had paid into the system. Just so you know, there are some debates over Social Security now. It's almost 100 years later. The big question that we're facing with today that people live longer and longer. And as a result, the ratio of old people to working people is not quite what it was back in 1930s when people lived to maybe 65 or 70. So some economists, especially on the conservative side, have offered to end what is called the defined benefit retirement programs and go to another system where the employer or the government would give you a share of your salary as an investment, which would then go into a 401k, which is kind of an investment platform. And then you would build your own nest egg. And then when you retire, you're expected to live off of that. It's much more sustainable for the employer or for the government because you know what you put into it for your employee. It shifts the risk to the employee, however, because you retire with a nest egg and you'd better invest it properly because if you put it in stocks and those stocks go down, that's a problem for you. So you want to be aware of the pros and cons of each system. You also get to vote, and that's one of the big debates between liberals, who today tend to want to protect Social Security, and conservatives who would prefer to switch to more of a 401k program. During the second Bush administration, there was a big effort to kind of ditch Social Security, though it failed because many retirees were up in arms against it. The other main piece of legislation that is passed during the second New Deal would be the Wagner Act, named after one of its sponsors in Congress. And that's one that is designed more to protect workers because they obviously suffer through the Great Depression as well, especially if they are unionized. Normally, when you lose jobs or your salary goes down, the way to protect yourself is to unionize and to negotiate from a position of strength for your employer. Except that during the Great Depression, employers don't like people who are unionized, and there's a strong chance that you might be fired if you're part of a union. And so that makes your bargaining position weaker. Well, the Wagner Act introduced some protections for people who are unionized. In the 1930s, it is established that you cannot fire a person just because he's a member of the AFL. Or the CIO, the American Federation of Labor, is an old trade union that we studied when we talked about the Gilded Age. It dates back to the late 19th century. The CIA is a Congress of Industrial Organization, and that's also appearing in 1935, so it's a product of the Great Depression. The big distinction between the trade union is that the AFL tended to be a white organization, very male and very elite, so more for workers that would have a special skill, like say, welders, where the CIO was more open to workers of all walks of life and all races. Nowadays the two have merged, so yeah, the AFL-CIO. This is one area where the legacy of the New Deal is more limited because in the past few decades we've seen a decline in union membership, as well as, I should mention, a decline in the growth of wages going to the working class. That's part of the growing income inequality that we've had since the 1970s. Again, Roosevelt had no idea how the public would respond to the second New Deal, which was far more liberal than the first one had been. And he just waited for 36 and the re-election campaign. In that case, he was on the ballot. And as it turned out, he was re-elected in a huge landslide, and he had huge majorities in Congress as well. So I figured I can go back and do even more. And the more meant mostly to fight back against the Supreme Court. Because by that point, some businesses had sued the AAA and the NRA and argued that they were illegal under the US Constitution. And indeed, the US Constitution grants very few economic powers to the federal government. It is only in charge of interstate commerce, whatever that might be. Anyway, that's what the Supreme Court decided. Remember that Supreme Court justices are named by previous presidents, so it's largely the Supreme Court that is a legacy from the 1920s and the conservative justices appointed by Republicans. So they struck down the two pillars of the first New Deal, the AAA and the NRA. What do you do when the Supreme Court goes against you? Well, there's not that much you can do as a president because Supreme Court justices serve as a lifetime appointment. The one thing that is not specified in the Constitution is how many people are on the Supreme Court. And so Roosevelt offered to change that, and he set up a plan called the court packing plan by its critics, which would have been to appoint an extra 6 justices, if I recall well, to have a 15-member court. Officially is to help the old justices accommodate the amount of labor that they had to do, In practice, it's just an opportunity to appoint 6 more justices, and he, as president, would have picked them. So it would have been a way to stuff the courts with friendly liberal justices in the future. And that's why the opponents call that the court packing plan. Well, it's a plan, not a law, because even though he had a majority in Congress, the Democrats voted against it, thinking that he went too far. And there are fears in the 1930s that Roosevelt might turn into a kind of dictator like you had in Italy, Germany, or Russia. One thing that we will see in the 20th century is presidents getting more and more powerful, and Franklin D. Roosevelt would be very much part of that process. And so Congress defeated his court-packing plan. At this point, Roosevelt was very angry at the Democrats in Congress then, especially the more conservative Democrats who had voted against him, and so he tried to purge them. And the purge plan was also a name given by critics. It was a reference to the policies of Stalin in Russia, who in the late 1930s purged the Communist Party of his enemies by usually having them arrested, sent to short trials, shot, or sent to the Gulag for years on end. What Roosevelt had in mind was far less violent. All he wanted was to run against those people in the 1938 midterm election and convince voters to kick out those Democratic members of Congress that were not 100% pro-Roosevelt. So it's kind of the president running against some members of his own party or pushing alternate candidates. And as it turned out, a lot of these congressmen targeted by Roosevelt were reelected anyway. So that purge plan was also a failure, and you still had a democracy based on the division of power where the Supreme Court and Congress still were as strong as the president was. So to finish, how should we assess the New Deal? And there the record is kind of mixed. If you look at all these graphs, you'll see that the economy improved somewhat after 1933, but only somewhat. The unemployment rate, for example, which had hit a high of 25% in May of 1933, was still in the double digits throughout the 1930s, which is really, really bad. Usually anything above 5% is considered a subpar employment. It improved a bit up until 1937, and then you have another recession, it gets worse. And if you look at the numbers, it does not get really better until 1940-41, meaning when World War II begins in Europe and you have a flood of orders for American tanks and airplanes, and eventually it's the World War II that ended the Great Depression, not the New Deal. And especially bad when you compare it to what was going on in other countries. Russia did not suffer from the Great Depression as badly. Germany suffered a lot, but recovered quite fast under Hitler. And France and Britain also recovered more easily than the US did. And surprisingly, Franklin D. Roosevelt is the one who is famous and celebrated today, even though his economic record was quite subpar. So what's the reason? Well, I think it's because of the power of style over substance. He was very good at selling his policies, and that's where his New Deal was successful, in that he had an agency for everybody, one for the farmers, one for industry, one for unemployed people, and he gained a lot of votes in that manner. Even though some of the policies were contradictory and did not work too well, he made a lot of friends. In a way, it's almost like a political machine. It's buying patronage. Also, he was a great communicator, and by that I mean on the radio. By the 1930s, the radio is the main means by which you reach your voters. And he had a great radio voice, so people who listened to him on one of these fireside chats, the whole family is gathered up around the radio, and it's as if the president was right there into your living room. And sure, the situation is improving slowly, but he feels your pain, he's on your side, and he likes you, and it's important, so let's re-elect him. And people did that in 1936. Amazingly, he went for a third term in 1940, which was another unprecedented thing about Franklin Roosevelt. Nobody had dared to have a third term since, well, George Washington. He was the one who had ruled against that when he left office. Teddy Roosevelt had tried to be elected for a third term in 1912, had failed. Franklin Roosevelt argued in 1940 that World War II was on the horizon in Europe, and it was best not to change presidents at this difficult time, and the public went along with him, and he got a third term. And then in 1944, he went for a fourth term, arguing that, well, it's the middle of World War II by then, and people should not change presidents in that time of crisis. So this is all I have to say about Franklin D. Roosevelt, an important president, not only because he ruled for a very long time, but also because his presidency saw a rise in how much the federal government is involved in the economy, and we're still dealing with that today. And also a rise in the powers of the president, and we're still dealing with the after effects of that today, and also the creation of an important program, Social Security, that still governs our lives today. Well, that's it for today. Next time we'll look at other personalities from the 1930s, including the president's wife and a governor/senator from Louisiana named Huey Long. Au revoir, see you next time.